Much. We'll start now so that we finish on time. I'm hoping that Maria will join us. I was going to suggest a round of applause if and when she does, but that might embarrass her. But the poor thing had
we didn't get any applause.
No, that's true. So it would be unfair, and fairness is what we're all about at Tortoise. Thank you for coming. Do we actually have... Yes, we've got tonight's question on the screen, a bracingly binary question, which I think is worth asking for two reasons. It forces us to think about what might constitute a result for Vladimir Putin, and it forces us to be honest about failings of Western diplomacy, statecraft, or anything else that might have contributed to a Putin result. And we've got some experts, particularly in Western diplomacy on my left. But before we get to that, I just want to emphasize we want to hear from all of you. Whether you are an expert, consider yourself an expert, or are not an expert, but just have views, it's very hard not to have been affected in some way or other by the fellow who's been running the Kremlin, either directly or indirectly, since 1999, 20 years, when we both sort of rocked up there ourselves. So please, a ThinkIn is a newspaper leader conference on steroids, so a lot of knowledge in the room, and we hope also a lot of opinions. And one of the things that we at Tortoise hope to get out of it is some story ideas, or failing that, at least a more finely honed opinion on whatever we're discussing, and that includes whether we've started with the right question or not. So I'm serious. Please pitch in if you want to contribute. The yellow stripe edging across the screen is a sort of a clock. The tortoise will go with it. When it reaches the end, we're done, and I will try to sum up. On my left, Sir Andrew Wood, former British ambassador to Moscow and frequent visitor to Moscow since. On my right, Dr. Sam Green from King's. What is the actual body that you lead?
The Russia Institute.
The Russia Institute at King's College London. And Maria, I'll introduce when she comes. She's with the Open Russia Foundation, which is about 10 minutes walk that way. And yeah, I will embarrass her with a story when she arrives. I cheated before coming in. I Googled, has Putin won? And went straight to a Wall Street Journal story, not the only one, about this particular quote. But after Trump won, Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, who obviously controls many billion rubles, received a message whose sender remains anonymous, but from a friend in New York saying Putin has won. So to that extent, somebody thought the question relevant. But look, I've spoken to Andrew and Sam before we started today, and Sam said he thought it was a good question, so he gets to answer it first. Yeah.
Does that suggest that Andrew said it wasn't a good question?
Yeah, absolutely right. But so has he?
Well, I said that it was a good question, but also I said I was going to be the annoying academic and argue with the premise. So we need to understand what field we're talking about. Right? My work's on domestic politics, right? And you sort of answered the question at the outset, right? Saying that he's been in power since 1999, right? 20 years is a good long run. From that perspective, I suppose he has won. He's consolidated a system of power around him that works, right? And that has certainly done him very well, and for a long part of that period has done reasonably well for ordinary Russians. They are not as rich as they were 5 or 6 years ago, but broadly speaking, much richer than they ever have been at any sort of historical point. Not necessarily freer, but that's another conversation.
Well, it could be part of this one.
Well, it could be, but that masks a lot of things, right? So we tend to have this view of Putin and people like him, autocrats, dictators, whatever term you want to use, as these sort of evil geniuses, evil you can dispute, but geniuses one way or another, sitting atop these massive systems with lots of resources at their disposal, who can create outcomes. They have levers, they have buttons, they know what to push and pull in order to keep themselves in power and deal with challenges. And then, of course, when we see these people then showing up in our own politics, we think that maybe they're playing this same sort of omnipotent game. And the reality is that when we look at the nitty-gritty of Russian politics, that's not what we're seeing. Right? What we see is somebody who, because he doesn't run a system where his power is based on the Constitution, because he rules despite institutions, not through them. He has to win the Russian political game every single day, right? And it's a great feat that he's managed to do that for 20 years. Right? Some days have been better than others. You mentioned steroids, right? So that helps win things like the Olympics. But he has a lot of advantages. He controls all the television channels that matter. He controls all the parties in the parliament, the electoral system, the courts, the police, the banks, number of other things, right, that give him structural advantages. And yet, every once in a while, challenges come up that he doesn't immediately have an answer to, and we see him and his team of people around him. I think the best description I can come up with is just throwing stuff at the wall to see what will stick, and then being very agile and responsive in adapting to those circumstances and trying to make the best out of what is not always a great situation.
Can I just pick you up on that point about having to win every day?
Yeah.
Because a former colleague who had worked in Beijing said something similar about the Politburo there, saying they had very slim margins of error. And that seemed to make sense, not least because they're dealing with close to 1.5 billion people. But isn't Russia fundamentally different in that it's emptier and less of a pressure cooker? I mean,
well, I'm not in a position to compare Russia and China in terms of how much a pressure cooker is. I'm not sure that population density, I mean, Moscow's a major city, most of the power is there, right? So that's an issue. We're still talking about 10, 12 million people right around him. Yeah. So if he faces an uprising there, that's something he has to worry about. But I think in terms of winning every day, there's two reasons for that, right? One is that when you don't come to power through elections. Obviously, they hold elections, right? But they're not won in the usual push and pull of electoral politics. So when you don't come to power through elections, you understand that elections are not necessarily going to be the way you leave power, right? And thus, you're not secure in your position until the next electoral cycle. You understand that there are challenges to your extra constitutional rule, right? That can come up in the interim. The other thing is that when you do lose power, right, you don't go on a speaking tour. You don't retire into consulting and making money off of investment banks and that sort of thing. Most people who have been in positions of that kind of power for significant periods of time leave office either in shackles or in a box. And neither of those are, well, one option is more attractive than the other, I suppose, depending on the timing, but neither of those are the way he wants to go. He wants to control his own exit, and so he does have to make sure that that they spend a lot of time and money conducting opinion polls and focus groups and trying to take the temperature of society, which is not what you would expect a dictator to do, right? Given our sort of classical ideas of sort of North Korea and Turkmenistan and Nazi Germany in terms of how this sort of politics works.
So do you think, just to be clear, that his longevity in power is a victory in and of itself?
It is, right? It's a victory that was not entirely of his own creation, right? So he had a long run of very good oil prices, but he also had a population that has not had any experience in the last 40 to 50 years of an improvement in their lives through a change in government, right? So there's the real problem for the Russian opposition is not to convince people that the country is poorly run and thus you should get rid of the people running it. Most people in Russia understand it's poorly run, right? The challenge is to convince people that if you were to elect somebody else, something might actually change for the better. And there has been nothing in the last several decades of their experience that would suggest that.
Before I turn to Andrew, can we have a little contrived audience participation? I jotted down a few respects in which he might be considered to have won. Economic, you mentioned, life hasn't been as bad under Putin for most Russians as it was under Yeltsin, or perhaps for most of them under the Soviet Union as well. A broader human development index, which might include the evolution of civil society. Overseas clout, Putin as the troublemaker. And then you can presumably measure his success or otherwise relative to his own goals and relative to the state of the country when he took over. So, shows of hands, please. Doesn't have to be based on anything more than a hunch. Who feels that he's been a winner in terms of the economic lot of ordinary Russians? I'm really surprised. Okay. Oh, we got a hand up there. All right. And in broader terms, quality of life. I've put human development index because we were looking at that in a different context yesterday. But yeah, 2. As a, I think in your notes we've got a section, global maverick. Yeah, yeah, that's a popular one. And then I suppose this is interesting for those of us who've had the good fortune to have been there a bit, compared with what he might have set out to do, which, again, your notes will show you one of his goals seems to have been to reformulate the Soviet Union in one way or another, or at least he described the collapse of the Soviet Union as a great political catastrophe. Anyone think that he's been a success in that respect? No. Thanks, David. Okay. And compared with 1999. Okay, who was around in 1999? You're all.
In Russia, that is not. I was also alive.
Yes. So, who thinks that Putin has strengthened Russia since 1999? Okay. Andrew, what do you think?
I'll take your last question first. I think he has been extremely destructive of Russia. You can say that he strengthened in the sense that he gave a period of greater comfort and assurance while the oil price was high, and because he did start in a relatively sensible way in restructuring the economy. But what he has done is to remove alternatives. Sam rightly mentioned the opposition parties as not being able to provide alternatives, but then the system is structured so as not to be able to do that. If you look now at the question of the succession, then I think most Russians come to the conclusion that the prospects are rather alarming. We tend to think in the West that the successor will be someone pretty much like Putin, coming straight from the system and so on. I think that's going to be very difficult to achieve and also undesirable. The economy is more dependent on oil and gas and to some degree coal than it was in the Yeltsin years, which were pretty chaotic. At least the Yeltsin years did have the possibility of different sorts of outcome. I think now they face the difficulty that Putin can offer nothing apart from his rule, or maybe a simulacrum of his rule, which is based on natural resources, rent from them mainly, not exclusively, mainly, and a corruption of mores, of government structures, of civic society, which far exceeds, in my opinion, even the difficult years that there were from 92 to the end of 99. the difficulty of any real change now, you could look at a Venezuela. I'm doing this for exaggeration, but
yeah.
a Venezuelan analogy. I don't think from anyone from within the immediate Putin circle, which is very small and very corrupt, could produce change, could liberate the power of civic society, get discussion going among people, could change the courts, could get away from the state possession of the main resources without actually violence preceding it. That is not to predict that there will be violence, just to say that I do not think. I think that he is in and the system is in a cul-de-sac.
So that's what you mean by it being hard to achieve a sort of continuity when for whatever reason, his time is up. I mean, I was interested.
Any successor, let's say, I don't know, Shoigu, the Minister of Defense.
Yeah.
He represents an interest. He would not have the automatic trust of everybody else in the immediate circle. He would have to achieve getting their trust by buying into their interests, not the country's interests particularly. And inherently, that would be difficult to do. It's illustrative of the fact that the current expectation in Russia seems to me, anyway, to be that Putin will have to stay on.
After 24.
That, to me, is the definition of a failure. I didn't like your title because has Putin won implies that somehow there's been a winning post, and he's got past it. You can say that he's won, and I agreed with everything that Sam said, but you can, if you judge it like that, he's still there, so you can say he's won. But Macbeth was still there until his head was chopped off, so he won in a sense. It's a deliberate comparison as well.
So is it complete fantasy to suppose that there might yet be a return to the streets of millions of Muscovites in the style of 1991, 1993, a popular but largely bloodless upheaval, and finally, after a delay of a generation, Eastern European-style elections?
Well, you have to make an awful lot of suppositions to actually, the big thing at present is that nobody knows.
Right.
And the fear among Russians, again, I bow to others, the fear among Russians is precisely that. They don't know what's coming. Yeah. Or they do know that Putin is not going to supply anything new. The average, certainly the polling shows that they don't want more foreign adventures of a militaristic nature, but they fear that there might be. If you look at the scale of emigration, it's very, very considerable, and it increased in 2012 when Putin came back with a policy which basically was to say we're not even going to talk about economic reform or social reform in the rather vague way which had been talked about under Medvedev. We're going to increase control from the center and state ownership of opinion, if you like, and if the economy is going to rise. And they've reached the point now he can't get out of it. I suspect that sometimes he probably has nightmares. I would have nightmares if I was him. But the Kremlin is a very strange place. You go in there and you are very, very much alone. I just tossed out a few ideas, really. If you look at the polls about the trust that there is in Putin now, it has gone down quite considerably. It's around 30%. If you look on respect for him, that's higher, around more than 60%. But they are different things, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I think the Russian expectations in the future are fearful.
Thank you. I'd be really interested to know what everybody else thinks, but while you're gathering your thoughts, I want to tell a very superficial story. I went back to Rostov-on-Don for the first time in 18 years last year to write a story basically about the World Cup. And they built a new airport. Driving in from the airport, we passed an Audi showroom, a Porsche showroom, a Land Rover showroom, I think another Land Rover showroom, and then there were 40 hotels to choose from. Last time I was there was maybe 2, 3. And the last time I was there was a war going on just a little bit to the south, and there was a train full of bodies from the previous war which hadn't been sorted yet. When I went to look for that, there was a beautiful railway museum. Students I met there had a choice of university exchanges in Germany and elsewhere in Europe, not with Britain because scant diplomatic relations with Britain as a result of arguments over Skripal et al. And I thought this country is completely transformed. And then you go back to Red Square and you got hundreds and thousands of British football fans really angry with the British press for portraying Russia as such a basket case. Why didn't you tell us it was such fun? They had no problem communicating because they just used Google Translate. They had no problem getting around. They just used Uber, really, really cheap. And I know it was a Potemkin World Cup in a way, but they didn't just transform one city. They transformed 11 or 12 in a very superficial way. I accept that. This was an experience put on for foreigners, but I thought, superficial things like that affect other people too, and give them jobs. So I just put that out there as a bit of a materialistic, superficial take on what Russia is like.
And how many Lada showrooms did you see?
None. What's the significance of that?
They're able, because of energy resources and so on, particularly, to import things that we make. They are not making... The economy is very narrowly focused. And it's not a good place to be, actually.
Right.
So coming on that very briefly, I mean, I was also in Russia for the World Cup, and I didn't go to any of the games, but it was a tremendous thing, right? It was a lot of fun. There were all kinds of languages being spoken in places where they'd never been spoken before, and people enjoyed it. One of the things that's interesting is that this sense of, well, why didn't you tell us, right, works both ways, right? So Putin's approval ratings actually began declining after the World Cup. And there's a lot of reasons. There's pension reform and economic things and other things going on that play into that. But one of the things that this experience did, as thousands or tens of thousands of people from around the world came into Russia, was to deflate this idea that you would get if you watched all the television channels, which a lot of people do, right? That the world is against us, right? And that it's full of Russophobia and everybody hates us and everybody's just trying to keep Russia on its knees, right? So that it's very hard to keep that message going. And I think that's a large part of the reason why, as Andrew said, the kind of animus, the public animus behind sustained conflict with the West has begun to deflate. There's people wanting, there's a story, I don't think it's entirely apocryphal, of a town in Siberia that discussed whether they should change their name to Syria, right, in order to get some of the reconstruction funds. So there's an economic aspect to it, right? But there's also a sense that, look, maybe some of this of this conflict is not as real as our television is telling us it is.
Right. Have we got that map of all the conflicts? We might have to cycle through. Right. So Crimea, Eastern Ukraine, involvement in Russia, and I'm not sure if we're actually, oh yes, we're showing there South Ossetia, where it all started in 2008. Tony Blair used to love the phrase punching above our weight about this country, right?
Always a mistake.
It was a mistake to use the phrase?
No, to you to do it.
To do it, right.
Stick to your own weight. Speaking as a small man, basically. But
Putin is also a small man, isn't he? And
Well, I think he's probably done that too.
Clearly keen to be seen to be punching above his weight, doesn't and using his veto with gay abandon in the UN Security Council. This isn't a country on its knees, is it?
Well, I mean, you could expand the list. It certainly doesn't compare to the maps we could draw for some other members of the UN Security Council.
What should we add to the list? Actually, if we had space on that, we would have included the
You could add
Ural Islands
in Moldova. You could.
Right.
I mean, I just came back from Brussels, where somebody from the External Action Service was asking me why Russia's interfering in elections and conflicts in Madagascar. I had no idea, right? But they are involved in the Central African Republic and various other places.
Right.
They've been involved in other places in both Eastern and Western Africa. They're present increasingly in Venezuela, or at least they want to be seen as present, right? And so, on some level, there was Obama, right, said Russia's just a regional power, and they've clearly demonstrated that at least to a certain degree they can go beyond the region. But is this really agenda-setting power outside of Syria and Ukraine? And maybe not, right? They, on the other hand, right, I'm not quite sure why we're surprised by this. This is the country with, the second, or by some measures, the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. Yeah. It has a very large and very long military tradition, right? It has a large apparatus around the foreign ministry, which has begun to sort of come to the fore. And it's begun to understand how to use corporate interests and other interests around the world in ways that other countries have done for a long time, and is a member of the Permanent Five on the Security Council. So the fact that that Russia was not present in some of these places for a long time looks a little bit more like the aberration in sort of the longue durée scheme of things than this map does, to me at least.
Steph, are we not being heard? Okay. So from the diaphragm, everyone, and we should be aware of these microphones. I should have said that earlier. Also, the white robots are cameras. We are recording this. We're not live streaming it tonight. We're live streaming it. Wow. We're live to the world. I take your point that we shouldn't perhaps be surprised by Russia's activities in Ukraine and Crimea. But
No. We should be surprised, right? We should be surprised by the specifics of the activities. That Russia would have a global agenda in and of itself is not surprising. That Russia's global agenda would be to go to war over a trade deal, right? Or to use chemical weapons on the territory of a country with which it's not involved in a conflict, and a NATO member state to boot, right? Is obviously surprising, right? That you would simply annex a piece of territory, right? Is obviously surprising and jarring, and is meant to be surprising and jarring.
Sorry, go ahead.
Make 2 points. First of all, I don't see how any of this is in the interest of the Russian people.
No.
Secondly, most of the things that they've done are of doubtful long-term benefit. There is no point in punching above your weight for the sake of punching. You have to have some clear aims in view. The clear aim for Ukraine is to put it back where in Russian eyes, or in the eyes of the Kremlin, it belongs, that is, as a part of the Russian space. That in itself is a throwback to earlier Russian or Soviet ideas, and I don't think it shows creativity or really thinking things through on the part of Vladimir Putin.
But do you think we're going to have to get used to a divided Ukraine?
I think we're more likely to have to get used in the longer run to a divided Russia.
That's interesting.
What's happening in Ukraine is a real civic revolution. It's the people there are much more conscious of the possibility that they may have some say in what governments do. They certainly have much freer press, and I would have quite a lot of confidence in Ukraine becoming in the longer term, a better place than Russia. And there are plenty of people in Russia, I mentioned immigration.
Yeah.
You ask those people, who are mostly younger people, why they're leaving, it's because they cannot make their personal lives creative and so on in Russia.
But how does Russia, you spoke about a divided Russia. Do you mean a geographically divided one? You mean the...
Well, I'm just imagining. It's slightly easier now to imagine the possibility of a Russian in turmoil than in, say, 5-10 years' time than it was before, because Putin and his regime are deeply corrupt. Their control is dependent on, ultimately, force. They don't have fresh programs to think about and push through. And I think it's untypical of any society that can remain a constant. Change is threatening to the regime, but the regime will be condemned to try change at some stage, and then we will see what happens. I'm not predicting it's going to collapse, but it is a risk that Russians fear.
We can agree that messing around in the former Soviet near abroad hasn't been good for ordinary Russians. But what about the fairly widely accepted narrative that the West has been played for fools repeatedly? Or put another way, was the annexation of Crimea preventable?
I think those are different questions.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't think the West was played for a fool because the Russians invaded Crimea.
but what about the narrative that Western diplomacy has been flat-footed, what we used to call Kremlin watchers, in failing to anticipate and, if we really care about it, prevent the redrawing of the post-Soviet map by force, and secondly in Syria, was that preventable? That in the end it was Russian boots on the ground that seemed to be.
I think that Syria is a thoroughly different matter from Ukraine. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, and it's presenting a counter narrative to the Kremlin narrative, in the same way as once upon a time Poland did to the Soviet Union. So I think there's a different things. I don't see that the Russians have actually gained much in invading Syria, or not invading, supporting a regime like Assad's in Syria. I don't see that that's a permanent gain to Russia, unless you think of the whole of world politics, as the Kremlin often does, as a sort of game, which you can win, and that there are goals to be scored. Syria is a burden to Russia. I'm not in the least bit knowledgeable, let alone expert on that area, but it doesn't seem to me that using chemical weapons and huge force to keep someone like Assad in control of Syria is a gain. I wouldn't think that was a gain, but then perhaps I'm too pacifist or something. But for the Kremlin, it was a gain. I do not think that the Russian people are now particularly gratified or happy about it.
Who's been there recently?
To Russia, not Syria.
I mean Russia. Anyone been to Syria recently?
What's recent?
Well, in the last 53 years, as far as I'm concerned, it'd be more recent.
Well, I've been there, in that.
Right. No, but if you don't mind me asking, do you speak Russian? Are you from there?
Russian.
Right. Is he one?
So actually,
Or is it?
I actually wanted to answer that question because I think it's just.
Sorry, what's your name?
Anya.
Anya.
Yeah. So I'm Russian, but I've been living in the UK for the last 5 years. And I just think that comparing 1991 to 2019 doesn't really make sense because no matter matter where you look at, 2019 would be better from the economical perspective, from the quality of life perspective, because that's just economical revolution and globalization and such things like that. So exchange with the German university has absolutely nothing to do with Russia. It's just globalization.
Okay.
I think that even if you're like, think about it, if you were tasked to build a modern concrete house instead of an old broken wooden shack, no matter what would you've built, it would be better to live in. But would that be somebody with more experience or somebody nicer building that concrete building? It would have been better. So when you ask the question whether I think that, well, whether all of us think that the economic conditions in Russia have improved in the last 20 years, yes, they have. But was it because of Putin? Not at all. I think that literally anybody else would have done a better job.
Okay.
I agree with you, actually. I think there was, when Yeltsin went, there was a possibility of a proper election. And Primakov would have been better than Putin. Putin has chosen the way of force. And that traps him as well as Russia for now.
Can I ask you, sorry, we'll come back in a second. You raised your hand on the Russia question.
Yeah, I go quite a lot. I work a lot with Russia. I work in business development, but
Right.
studied Russian and lived in Siberia for a while. And I'm moving back to Moscow next week.
Oh.
Yeah. Do I have to answer the question?
Well, I'm interested to know what you. I'm interested to know what you think. Whether there's a sense of sadness, loss over what might have been, or whether in fact there's a residual level of loyalty to and even affection for a person that they think of as a success.
I think Mikhail Zigar, who was
You tell me your name if you don't mind.
Isabella.
Isabella, thanks.
He ran the independent TV channel called Tortoise.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote this really good book a couple of years ago called All the Kremlin's Men, in which he kind of the opening chapter was about how it's a complete myth to think that Vladimir Putin is one person. It's an organism that's living, that reacts to different things, that makes a decision off the cuff a lot of the time, and a lot of the time decisions are made without even getting to the man at the top. So I think although he is the figurehead, he does make a lot of decisions. I think it's short-sighted to say that it's him that knows about everything that goes on, that makes, decided that those two groom detectives would come here. I think that's quite a short-sighted view.
I haven't read the book. I obviously need to, but yeah.
Very good.
Does it sort of sustain this view that he's busking it much more than we think he is?
I think there's just a lot of other people who have considerable power, and there's so much power play within that tight-knit circle that he can't be. It is hard to hold him accountable for all the decisions that are made.
Two things playing off of that. One is obviously, at some level, constitutionally, he is accountable. He's the president. There should be elections, right? So if you're unhappy with the way things have gone, coming back to this question about the economy, right? One of the things that happened in the 90s, economic reform had its upsides and its downsides in the 90s. One of the things they did successfully do was go from an economy that was entirely controlled by the state in 1991 to 70% of GDP being in private hands by 1997, right? We are now back to 70% of GDP being controlled by the state, right? Directly one way or another, right? So we've reversed, Russia has reversed a lot of that reform, and that's one of the reasons that Andrew and others are saying that people feel that their opportunities are limited. We talk about the power of the middle class. Well, the middle class in Russia predominantly works for the state. Right? It's a very different kind of dynamic. So why are those decisions being made? In whose interests are those being made? Why is it that all of this economic activity is ending up back with the state? Well, Putin, whether he's making those decisions directly or not, has to bear some responsibility for the group in whose interests they're being made. But then this question of, well, do we hold Putin accountable or not? I frankly don't know which is the scarier idea. You mentioned the gentleman who showed up in Salisbury, right? So is it a scarier thought that Putin would have ordered a chemical weapons attack on the territory of another state with whom he wasn't at war? Or that two gentlemen from the GRU or otherwise would have thought that it was okay to go ahead and use chemical weapons and been able to use those chemical weapons, right, without a command from the commander-in-chief. Both of those are fairly scary, I think, thoughts. I'm not sure which one. I kind of go both ways in terms of which one I'm more frightened by. But either way, that is so the system that Ziga is describing, that you're describing, which I think is absolutely true, is allowed to function by design to a certain extent. It allows a certain kind of rule. So even if we're saying that Putin isn't involved in any decision, as the person at the top of the system, does he still bear some responsibility for it?
Is there a sense that he's shifted norms, goalposts, so that, for example, when Novichok is deployed on a park bench in Salisbury, most people kind of yawn? Or was that, at the time, truly shocking? What's the general feeling there?
In Russia, even, or
No, I mean here.
Yeah.
Here. Truly shocking. Do you think the British government's response was adequate? No? What should have been done? I mean, there was a substantial expulsion of diplomats. Was there not?
I think the British response actually was phenomenal, given the circumstances, right? That London was involved in rather tense negotiations over Brexit and a number of other things with the European Union, and facing an administration in Washington run by somebody, A, who has a particular relationship with the Kremlin, and B, who doesn't have a lot of cognitive, reflective capability, to have been able to very quickly get its allies behind a robust international response involving sanctions and expulsions. Now you can debate whether or not that's effective in terms of actually changing Russian behavior, right? But to have been able to do that, right, was a real feat of diplomacy, and I don't necessarily lay that at the doorstep of Downing Street, but at least they knew to get out of the way and let the Foreign Office do their job, and they seem to have done the job very, very well. I see Andrew's frowning, maybe disagrees.
I don't know. I was in the Foreign Office in the last century, so.
But no, I think it was a job reasonably well done given the circumstances. Today, Russia's having its annual economic forum in St. Petersburg today, and Putin said that he thinks it's time for Britain and Russia to move on and let bygones be bygones. I'm not sure that London sees it quite the same way. But that does speak to some degree of desire in Moscow to find a way to get to a point where they're not under sanction, where they're not faced with all the economic uncertainty and increasing cost of capital and things that come along with this attitude that they have generated in the world towards themselves by first poisoning people in Salisbury and then laughing about it on television.
Actually, the same question would apply to the murder of Nemtsov, which is actually more shocking.
Yeah.
They have murdered people abroad before,
Yeah.
but the killing of Nemtsov was blatant.
Yeah, I agreed, and I'd like to come back to that, and to you in a second. But first, sir, what's your name?
John. I was going to say that I think the thing I find more shocking about incidents like that is that they come from supposedly like an organised nation that has a seat at tables where...
We're talking about the Skripal.
Yeah, but I mean, like, I think we're becoming increasingly used to threats of death from organised or non-nations, like there are terrorist attacks in developed nations more regularly than there used to be. But I think what's scary about that one is that it comes from an organisation that has a seat at the table in a lot of, and we have been led to believe that we're like the countries in which, or the country we live in at the moment is like in control, and so then it comes from another nation that we've been, I guess, told that we're in control of the situation when it comes from another nation, and we're not necessarily under the impression that we are living in a nation that ensures our safety from other nations anymore, rather than just from unorganised pockets of the world.
So events like that are shocking partly because there's a...
It makes the threat that living in a country that is, I guess, at war with another nation.
Yeah.
There's plenty of people who live in situations where they do live in fear of that. Living in the UK didn't necessarily feel like you were at threat of that until events like that happen.
Right.
And I think that like the murder of Khashoggi in Saudi Arabia is similar.
Yeah.
Because it makes it feel like here's a nation that we accept doing things that we don't accept, and how adequate is our response to that, and how in control are we of preventing that from happening again.
Sorry, yes.
Sorry. 2 points quickly. One being what has happened to Petrov and Bashir now? If it was Putin's choice, and they did that whole big Russia Today debacle where that was viewed by the world, and has anyone heard of them since? Which makes me think, if Vladimir, it was his choice, is he happy with them? Would they not have been like heralded as doing something successful abroad? So that is where my kind of doubt comes from as to whether it was Putin's choice or whether he really wanted it, because they kind of disappeared.
Yeah.
And
unlike the killers of Litvinenko.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And point 2, I think Putin has always made quite clear in speeches, etc., that anybody who is double agent is a traitor, and they should be not burned to a crisp, but something destroyed.
They've done that.
Pardon?
I said they've done that.
Yeah. But point being, although it's still shocking, it's he's made that point very clear for a long time that if Skripal was a double agent, which obviously the Russians to some degree believed that he was, that was kind of the inevitable end for him. Not that I'm apologising, but just kind of to consider those points.
Yeah.
I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah. Yes.
Just sort of going back to your point, as in, was that the reaction of the UK government, was that correct or not correct? I think the development of Russia reminds me of the development of a child in a way, because it was sort of born in 1991, and then it was developing, and everyone was so amazed at how greatly they've grown, how many things they've learned to do. And I feel like now it's like the bad teenage years, and it's just going completely nuts. And then in the end, in the future, it's going to grow up and understand all its mistakes and stuff. But I feel like whenever a country responds to Russia being an angry teenager with an angry sanctions and angry, we are no longer friends, it's even like the reaction of Russia in response is even worse. It's like, okay, sanctions on you, and then sanctions on you, and then sanctions on you, and basically in the end, people of the countries are are at fault in a way, because we are feeling worse because of all this situation. So that's why I don't know if the reaction was correct, because I think that it only caused damage and havoc and problems between two countries as diplomatic kind of parties. But I don't think that Putin personally was involved in this specific poisoning situation.
Sorry, yes. Sorry, what's your name?
Paige.
Yeah.
Sort of on that theme, and what I was going to touch on, what Sam said earlier about their involvement in Venezuela and sort of just wanting to be seen. Like, do you think the West gives Russia too much credit? And like, how does that affect Putin's power both within Russia and on the international stage? And also, how I feel like we always sort of assimilate Russia with Putin, and like that's also not necessarily true, and I think that can kind of have a negative effect on diplomatic relations, sort of what Anya said.
Yes, which leads to the interesting point that one of your former colleagues, Tony Brenton, has something in common with Donald Trump, which is that they've said, forgive me, you can come back at me at this, made the point often in many different ways, look, we need to be talking to these guys. And in a sense, that's what your remark makes me think of is perhaps we need to put Putin on the naughty step, but please, not a whole nation, right?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, on the question of sanctions, I think we've done exactly the right thing. I think the Skripal is a separate subject. The invasion of Ukraine, where 10,000 people at least have been killed, and the seizure of Crimea, where not so many have directly been killed, but those are absolute wrongs. And they're not accepted by the Ukrainians, and if I was Ukrainian, I wouldn't accept them either. I think sanctions to that is a perfectly legitimate response, and it is, at the very least, a response that makes the Russians at least potentially more cautious about doing something else like that. I strongly agree with your important point that there's a difference between the Russian people and the Russian state. The state seems to me more like a kind of frozen anarchy than actually what I would call a state, with proper institutions, but nonetheless. But it's very difficult to react to a country doing something which is you consider to be blatantly wrong without hurting the people. I spent rather too many years, perhaps, in Yugoslavia, and I knew Milosevic very well. I didn't at all like it when we went and started bombing Belgrade. I'm not convinced it was the right thing to do, but I can see why it happened. I'd let him make a decision. And I was in Russia at the time, and so it was different. Nonetheless, you do come to points where you do things you'd very much rather not. Of course, we would like to have a broad relationship with a prosperous and happy Russia. That's not what we've got. I think that correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think Russian people are rejected or despised in this country as people. There's a lot of suspicion about people that buy enormous mansions in Highgate or whatever, and so the blood will should be. But nonetheless, I don't think that there is Russophobia in Britain exists.
Anya, I'm sorry to get you out of your notes, but and anybody else who is Russian, is there Russophobia in this country? Do you get stick for?
Well, I wouldn't maybe call it as far as phobia, but there are definitely comments that I'm sometimes quite frankly tired of.
Assumptions made.
Yeah, a lot of assumptions, a lot of comments. Actually, right after the poisoning, a border control officer made a comment, which I thought was deeply inappropriate for his job.
What did he say?
He joked about how I'm coming to poison someone, which I wasn't.
As an effort at flirting, it was rather bad.
Well, yeah, so I don't know if it's just a kind of a cultural jokes, like we would joke about, I don't know, French people loving baguettes, Russian people loving poison. I don't know, but I do hear it a lot.
My wife is American, and Americans hear it a lot too.
Well, yeah, my wife is Russian, right? And I've certainly heard that. I first came to Moscow in 1999, as at the same time as you, and we had just finished bombing Yugoslavia. I got one of the usual sort of document checks in the metro, and somebody looks at my passport, and a police officer, right, and says, oh, U.S., NATO, you want to bomb Moscow the way you bombed Belgrade, and I say, well, not while I'm here, right? But the reality is it does hit people, right? So we have unexplained wealth orders and other things that are meant to hit the people with the mansions and Highgates. Of course, they can afford the lawyers. What happens is you walk into a bank, if you're a Russian, or you walk in, you want to open a business, you want to open an account, right? The level of scrutiny and just the level, the number of counterparties, whether it's in banks or insurance companies, who just don't want to have anything to do with you because of where you're from, right? Without doing any due diligence on where the money might be coming from, what you're actually doing, right? Is problematic, and it is to a large extent doing Putin's work for him, right? Because all of this becomes fodder for television, for stories coming home that allow Putin and his friends to say to the Russian people, look, you don't have friends other than us, right? The West doesn't want you. The West is Russophobic. You stick with, stick with what you know. The Russian phrase is your own shirt lies closer to the body. I know it doesn't translate very well, but you get the point.
I should just give a shout out to legitimately Russian-owned mansions in Highgate, right? There's such a thing. Presumably,
of course.
There's legitimately French or Lebanese-owned mansion in Highgate. Yeah, let's just stipulate that. Amazingly, the flag has already gone up. So that means that unless anyone wants to jump in and give their halfpenny worth, it falls to me to sum up, because we do some conventional journalism as well. As those of you who are Tortoise members will know, we publish on the app, we publish regular stories, and we publish opinion pieces. And opinion on a subject like this needs, as you were pointing out, Andrew, to be carefully formed. I'm much too prone to knee-jerk opinions, having written leaders for the Times for 10 years. But I am interested, surprised actually, by the strength of opinion in the room, which seems to say, no, he hasn't won. My own view at the start of this evening was that by many metrics, it's undeniable that he's been, certainly the Russian zone, that he's been a phenomenally successful leader. As you were pointing out, Sam, a great deal of polling, which is surprising for someone who is thought of outside the country as an autocrat, and most of it showing very consistent consistently high levels of public support. The fact that trust is going down is interesting, isn't it? But and no real evidence that these polls are rigged. I think one of the great tragedies about Putin is that he could have won 3 or 4 consecutive elections without rigging them.
Sure.
But I take your point that so much could have been done so very differently to so much greater advantage for ordinary Russians over the last 20 years, and that is an abiding tragedy. It is, however, a what if, and Russians live with the Russian reality, which is partly the one that I saw in Rostov last year, and I'm yet to be completely persuaded, as you suggested, that there was a sliding doors moment in 99, and it could have gone very differently. Let's remember that he was, we counted it up for the notes, the 6th prime minister in 3 years when he took office as prime minister in 99. There was no real prospect of a way out of political turmoil then, and the fact that he found one surprised everyone and earned him possibly years of gratitude from many Russian voters. Anyway, as you can see, Tortoise's editorial point of view on Putin and whether he won and whether that's a valid question is a work in progress. But required reading, All the Kremlin's Men, for me and all those of you who haven't. And there was a really interesting point that I just wanted to pick up on. Where are Petrov and the other GRU guy, Bashirov.
Yep.
Now, great question. Really hard to get an answer to, but we are Tortoise, so we go slowly, methodically, and we'll try and find an answer to that. I think it would be a great scoop. Anyway, the flag is up. If anybody knows, by the way, just see me after. Thank you very much for coming. If you're not a member, do consider signing up. Do come back. We have another ThinkIn on a similar theme during our Festival of ThinkIns, which is our launch party, our delayed launch party at the end of the month. Please feel free to come to that too. And thank you, Sir Andrew. Thanks, Sam. And thank you all very much for coming.